I'm Sarah Posner. I'm senior editor at Religion Dispatches and the host of the Posner Show, which, if you like, you can get a subscription to in your iTunes or in your RSS reader if you go to bloggingheads.tv/subscribe, and also to any of the other shows that appear on Blogging Heads. And today, my guest is Paul Waldman, who's a contributing editor at the American Prospect magazine. And we're going to talk today about atheism and the Reason rally that took place on the Mall on Saturday, and the prospects for an atheist/secularist political movement in our current political culture. So I thought perhaps, Paul, what I'd use as our starting point today is Herb Silverman's piece in the Washington Post. Silverman is the president of the Secular Coalition for America, and he talked about the possibilities for using the Christian Coalition as a model, which seems kind of shocking because, of course, the Christian Coalition is everything that the secularists are against. And he said that the things that he admired in terms of being a good political strategy that the Christian Coalition has done is that they put aside theological differences amongst themselves. They work together on a core set of political issues that they do agree on, and they do things to grab media attention. And certainly, the Reason rally that took place on the Mall on Saturday seemed to be a sort of event that was designed to grab media attention. I think it was referred to by some of the people involved as being the Woodstock of atheism. But did that work, do you think?
Well, that may be a little
in
bit
terms of grabbing media attention.
That may be a little bit of an overstatement. I don't know if it was quite Woodstock. I saw some...
And probably not a good thing if it had been.
Yeah.
In terms of their PR.
And I saw some people claiming that there were 20,000 people there. I don't know if that was accurate or not. But, you know, when you're figuring out whether or not you want to get media attention, obviously there's a danger in the fact that the things that get the most media attention tend to be the most provocative. And this, I think, is one of the sort of central tensions that people in the secular movement have, is how provocative do they want to be? You know, there have been lots of cases where some local organization has, you know, bought billboards or ads on buses that try to make the argument directly for giving up religion. And of course, religious people get very mad, and then there's a controversy. But I think that's really the central question. I don't know if I'm sure that within those organizations they debate it, but they certainly don't seem to have come to an answer, is do they want to spend their time trying to convince people that they're right? That's one approach. And then how do you do that is a whole other question, that they're right about religion. Or do they want to kind of improve their own image in the way that let's say, any kind of other group might do. And, you know, the model the alternative model there is, for instance, the gay rights movement. Now, the gay rights movement had lots of particular, like, legislative goals and legal goals, but they also, I think, were very conscious for the last decade or two about the need to get ordinary straight people who maybe didn't know that they knew gay people to have a different kind of view of who gay people were. And so, you know, that happened over a long course of time. I think popular culture was really important to that. You know, one of the things that they identified very early on was that one of the best predictors of how you feel about gay people is whether or not you know any, or know that you know any.
Right.
And so the more people...
Is it your brother, your cousin, your neighbor? Right.
Right. And somebody on your favorite TV show is not a perfect substitute for that, but it's a pretty good substitute. You can begin to start to see them as individuals and not this kind of undifferentiated mass. And so that then ended up leading to this sort of virtuous cycle where the more gay people felt accepted, partly through popular culture, the more willing they were to come out, and then the more straight people actually knew, oh, my cousin is gay. I didn't know that before, and I see him as a person and not just as, you know, this kind of sort of stereotypical image that I have. And so one way for the secular movement to achieve its goals in the long term would be to spend its attention on that, trying to get people who don't believe in God to talk about it frankly and honestly without sort of confronting religious people about saying you're wrong, instead just saying this is who I am and can you accept me? Now that's not something that all secular people agree with, obviously, but it's a different kind of goal from persuasion. And so, the problem you get into is that when the attempts at persuasion tend to be resisted very, very strongly. And obviously, when you're telling somebody everything that you've been taught since you were a day old by your parents, and everything that you believe about the universe is not only wrong, but it's stupid and infantile. Obviously, people put a very strong resistance to that. And then you get into very kind of hostile arguments, and that persuasion tends to be very difficult.
Well, I think that there are two things going on within the secular/atheist movement, and I see a distinction in the strategy of, say, the Secular Coalition for America, which is an umbrella organization that includes some of the atheist organizations, and, say, some of the more overtly atheist organizations like the Atheist Alliance International and the Atheist Alliance, I think it's called the Atheist Alliance of America. There's an international organization and a U.S.-based organization. And I think that among the atheists, there's a very strong bent towards the Richard Dawkins view that, religion is irrational and crazy and who would believe it, and then the secularist groups, particularly the SCA, I think are very focused on how can we have a lobby that has a comparable power to religious lobbies, which I think lately we've seen quite a bit of them flexing their muscle, particularly around the contraception issue and the Affordable Care Act. How do we create a lobby that has the same sway with legislators and policymakers towards the goal of having secular-based policymaking as opposed to policymaking that's spurred by religion? And I think those two things are not necessarily in conflict with each other, but I think that a secular movement could run into problems if it's seen as being so anti-religion, then as opposed to being for religious freedom, and the way we get to religious freedom is by having secular policymaking.
Right. Well, lobbying creates its own set of challenges, and the most effective lobbies are the ones that can make members of Congress afraid. And in order to be afraid of your group, they have to see you as kind of a cohesive force that can act as one. And this, I think, is one of the central problems that the secular community, or whatever you want to call it, and that's its whole other problem, is what actually these people get called. We can talk about that in a minute. But one of the problems that they have is that they don't really act as a cohesive, unified force. And, over the weekend, the MSNBC show Up with Chris Hayes had a 2-hour discussion about atheism. And one of the most interesting things I thought was when Chris Hayes said that even though he doesn't believe in God, he feels like that part of his identity is like way down on the bottom of the list of all the different things he is. And what it put me in mind of was how you sometimes hear Republican politicians say, I'm a Christian first and an American second and a Republican third.
Yeah.
Because there are so few people who put that atheist or secularist or whatever at the top of their identity list, it makes it hard for them to create that sense of community and bonding that will then enable them to call on those people to act as a cohesive force. And if they can't act that way, then they're not going to be able to make the legislators afraid. Like at the moment, no member of Congress looks at a piece of legislation that somehow affects religious freedom or the separation of church and state and says, wow, I really don't want to piss off those secularists. Nobody thinks that. Nobody's afraid of them. And so... Well,
an interesting other thing that was going on this weekend while the Reason Rally was going on was the Young Democrats. So I think that part of the Reason Rally was to show that, this is not just a movement of many Americans, but it's particularly a movement of young people who are increasingly identifying as a none, if not an atheist, in public opinion polls about religion. And at the same time, Young Democrats of America, which is the arm of the Democratic Party that does outreach to young people under 30 or 35, I think, was having a conference on how to do faith outreach. So they were educating young Democrats on how to do faith outreach in campaigns.
Yeah, and those nuns.
So even the Democrats aren't going to sit up and take notice, it seems. Maybe I'm wrong, of the secularists.
Right. I think the Democratic Party is perfectly happy to have all those voters in their camp, and they are just as firmly in their camp as highly religious evangelical Christians are in their Republican camp. But I think they're worried that making too much of a show of it will alienate religious voters because they feel like they're nationally in conflict. And according to polls, those nones, people who don't identify with any religion, make up about 1 out of every 6 Americans. It's around 15, 16%. And they're...
And even more concentrated within the Democratic
yeah,
Party.
Absolutely. And some of those people actually do say in polls that they believe in some kind of God or higher power, but they don't identify with any particular religion. And it's a little hard to figure out exactly what all those people believe when they're checking that box. But it's probably the fastest growing segment of the religious segment of the population.
Right. And I think that box is very complicated. And I think it goes to what Hayes was saying on his show, which is that he's an atheist, but that's not the box he checks. And so there are people who identify as the none, N-O-N-E, who just, don't care, religion, whatever, but they wouldn't really necessarily identify themselves as an atheist. They don't think that much about whether they believe in God or a higher power. They don't think about it that much, but all they know is that they don't really have that much use for religion. So they get kind of lumped in with people who are the avowed atheists and also with the agnostics, the people who are questioning whether the existence of God. And then there's the other piece of it, I think, in the public opinion polling, which is that I think there are a lot of people who say if they were asked by a public opinion pollster to identify their religion, like, I know a lot of Jews who are atheists, for example, but they would say they were Jewish. Right. They wouldn't say they were an atheist, or they wouldn't say they were a nun, N-O-N-E.
Yeah, and you can figure that out, but I haven't seen any polls who have asked that. I mean, in the spirit of openness and candor, I'm a Jewish atheist, and if you asked me my religion, I would probably say Jewish. So you could ask another question on those polls, but I haven't seen anyone who actually has done it, who, after asking the religious identification question, then asks about their actual beliefs.
And Hayes on his show sort of brought this to the fore when Dawkins was talking about the some Catholic doctrine that he thought was ridiculous and silly, that Catholic presidential candidates should be asked about whether they really believe in that the communion wafer is actually the body of Christ. And Hayes was talking about how that was like a huge, that was a huge part of my Catholic upbringing. So he still and he talked about the sense of community in his parish and so on and so forth. So he still seemed to have, and I think this is true of a lot of Americans of many religions, an identification with the faith or the community that they grew up in. And they're not, not all the people who are atheists are of the Richard Dawkins mindset about what religion is.
And religion is really, really good at creating community. I mean, that's one of the most powerful things about it, and one of the reasons I think why it persists down through the ages is that it has all of these things about it that help to bond you to your other co-religionists. It has rituals, and it has even physical spaces where you go together with those other people. It's got sacraments and sacred texts, and all of these things that tell you that you are connected, even beyond the theology, which of course says this. But all these things about the sort of practice of your life that connect you to those other people who are your co-religionists. It's very, very difficult, not totally impossible, but very difficult to adhere to a religion without having that connect you to other people. On the other hand, disbelieving in God is something that most people, I think, probably come to on their own, through their own sort of process of, thinking and reading, and you can take on that belief and then hold to it all by yourself, and you never have to connect to other people who feel the same way you do. And so, I think it's only natural that even many atheists who were brought up in some kind of a religious tradition still feel pulled by that sense of community that is created and that bond to other people. And I don't know that there's any solution to that from the standpoint of atheists, how you could create an atheist community. And I mean, I think there are people who have, and there are, there are secular humanistic Jewish organizations, and there are things like that where people have tried to make some kind of attempt to create that same sort of sense of community. But I think that the piece that's missing is probably the kind of sacredness, the feeling that it's actually this higher power that's commanding you to do this. And so those efforts at creating those communities are, I think, they're smaller and less successful over the long run.
Yeah, although I do think I spoke at an atheist convention a couple of years ago. It was in Canada. It was the Atheist Alliance International Convention. And so there were people there from all over the world because it was the international convention. But it was mostly people from Canada and the United States, just because of the location. And it was interesting because I think that just the act of going to the convention was very important to these people in terms of community building. Feeling like they were with like-minded people for a weekend in a hotel in Montreal. But I think also there seemed to me, I think you're right about the sacredness, but I think there's a couple of things that really tie these atheists together, or at least these atheists at this convention, and that was science and comedy. I think that there's some comedians on the atheism circuit who are incredibly popular and have almost these kind of cult followings. My talk at the convention was one of these concurrent panels that, I was up against one of these comedians, and he drew a much bigger audience than I did for a talk about the global ambition of the religious right. But I think that that is something that really ties them together. And I also think that because of figures like Dawkins, who's a scientist, and people like P.Z. Myers, who's really popular among atheists, that the dedication to a scientific view of the world and not denying evolution and not denying climate change are very important unifying factors. Not enough, I think, to have the influence that I would want it to see on politics in terms of teaching intelligent design or creationism in public schools, or the complete lack of action in Congress over climate change.
Yeah, the only problem is that in order to make the decision to go to a conference, say, you have to be really hardcore. And there are many more.
This is true, and the people were very hardcore.
There are many more people who can participate in their religion in kind of a half-hearted way, but still go to church and still feel connected, even if they're not, they're not the hardcore, and there certainly is a hardcore religious people, but you can be much more passive about it and still participate. The devotion to science. I think that. That's part of one of the things that's happened in recent years is that things have become so politicized that that I think there are a lot of conservatives, for instance, who would say that they're perfectly devoted to science in the abstract until it happens to run up against their political agenda, and so when they get to the point where all of the people that they trust politically, their favorite politicians, the media figures, are all telling them that hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of climate scientists all over the world are engaged in a massive conspiracy to convince you that the climate is changing when actually it's not. What we found is that they end up siding with the people that they feel political affinity for, and so their commitment to what the science tells them is pretty thin once it runs up against those other things that turn out to be higher on their on that list of what kind of identity is important to them. It turns out, I think, for many conservatives, that being a conservative is more important than trusting what science tells them and what scientists tell them.
Right, and I wonder how much of it. I mean, I think that there's a long-standing conservative Christian distrust of environmentalism and the theory of evolution. Obviously, you can go back to the Scopes trial. And it's not a theory of evolution; it's a fact. But even being able to have the conversation about it being a theory, and I think that one of the things that perhaps the hardcore atheists, the new atheists like Dawkins, make a mistake on is just talking about how religion is completely irrational and should be disregarded. When there are, that could be alienating to potential allies on these science fight fronts, right. Because there are religious people who don't see any disconnect between religion and science, and believe in evolution, and believe that climate change is happening, and believe that the government should intervene to regulate the environment. So, maybe that's one of these PR things that they could use a little work on. But another thing that I wanted to talk about in this context is the whole discussion that's going on right now around the contraception coverage requirement under the Affordable Care Act, and the way that the religious right has framed it as a religious freedom issue. And I think a mantle that a secularist movement could really grab a hold of right now is to make more sense of that conversation for people in a constitutional way, because I think that the issue has been framed largely as the conservatives are saying that the Obama administration is engaged in a war on religion because, they're making the Catholics do this thing that the Catholics think is a sin. And then on the other side is, well, this is contrary to public health and women's health, and getting lost in that conversation is, what is the interplay between the free exercise clause, which would enable the Catholics and does enable the Catholics to freely practice, and everybody else to freely practice their religion, versus the establishment clause that, hey, look, the government can't favor one of these religions over the other. And it sort of seems like, the conservatives should try to, should see the virtue of the government not endorsing one thing or another, because one day, an endorsement of a different religion might be something that they don't like. And so I feel like the establishment clause part of this is getting lost in the conversation, and that is something that the secularists really, it's an opening for them to really make a case for themselves on an issue that's been in the news and has drawn a lot of attention and is important to at least half the population.
Yeah, and I think they should make that case. Unfortunately, most Americans' commitment to not just freedom of religion, but a whole panoply of constitutional freedoms is circumscribed in some unfortunate ways. People think about freedom of religion, and that, to most people, I think, means freedom for me to practice my religion, but it doesn't extend to you.
Right.
In the same way that people say, I believe in freedom of speech, but somebody who's opposed to the government shouldn't be allowed to talk in our town, and his book should be taken out of the library. And so, I think that this is a perfect example of that. All the talk about how this is an issue of religious freedom, to the people who are making that argument, basically means that the Catholic Church, in this case, should be able to obey the laws it likes and disobey the laws that it doesn't like, and that everybody else should be subject to whatever their whims are. And you in the extreme cases, I don't know if you remember, but at one point during the primaries, Herman Cain said that if a town wants to ban a mosque from being built in its town, they should be able to do that. And he, right, I'm sure, thinks that he's a great believer in freedom of religion. But as far as he's concerned, right, freedom of religion means freedom for him to practice what he wants. And as long as he's, right, in the majority, well, that's fine. So...
Well, Gingrich, who's been almost as big an opponent of the separation of church and state as Rick Santorum with all of his nausea, also is in favor of a national ban on Sharia law. I mean, what could be a more obvious example of infringement of somebody's religious freedom than that?
Yeah, and I think you're right. I think that it should be the job of people who are sort of professional secularists, although there aren't very many of those, to be the ones making those arguments. I mean, they should be articulating that, and they should be on television writing op-eds to make clear to people what exactly the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause are really supposed to be about. And our history on this is checkered. On that same MSNBC program, Susan Jacoby, who's a writer, she wrote the book called Free Thinkers. She made the point that freedom of religion is really a secular idea, and the Puritans didn't come here because they wanted everybody to be free to practice as they wanted. They wanted themselves to be free to practice and to be able to impose that on anybody who happened to live in where they were living. So our whole history on this is people wanting to basically impose their own religion, and that ends up getting sort of twisted around to be their conception of what freedom of religion is. And we saw this with Santorum talking about how John F. Kennedy wanted, saying that he wanted an absolute separation between church and state, made Santorum want to throw up. In that context, that was another, back then in the 1950s and early 60s, there was a great conflict between Protestants and Catholics. What a lot of Protestants wanted to do was to make sure that no public funds ever went to a Catholic school. And so there was this great concern that Kennedy was just going to be a tool of the Pope, and that's why he had to be so emphatic about how he wasn't going to be doing that. And, it's one of the interesting transformations in the last few decades that now there's this, where the conflict between Protestants and Catholics was centuries old, now there's this alliance. And to a great extent, in the rhetoric from a lot of them, you hear that this alliance comes because they have a common enemy, and that's the secularists. That's the people who are waging war on Christmas, who want you to say happy holidays. And unfortunately, that enemy is not very strong and powerful.
Right. So the alliance between conservative evangelicals and conservative Catholics, which I think has really been much more visible, has been there for decades. Gradually in the early the early 70s, when they started to coalesce together around opposition to Roe versus Wade, but I think it has really become much more visible to the general public as opposed to people who watch the religious right for a living. In Santorum's campaign, now it's headlines in all the newspapers in America how Santorum can't win the Catholic vote, but he wins the evangelical vote in states that have a large evangelical population. And so the same demographic that was worried about the Vatican giving President Kennedy marching orders is now happy to be given marching orders by the Vatican or by the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, given the great alliance between evangelicals and Catholic and conservative Catholics on opposition to the contraception coverage. I mean, when you look at the public opinion polling on that, white evangelicals are more opposed to the contraception coverage than Catholics are. So it's that's a kind of interesting development, and again, it's a coalition not around opposition to contraception, because evangelicals have while there are some evangelicals who are opposed to contraception, they have no equivalent of the Vatican or the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops that tells them what the doctrine that they have to follow is on that. But the coalition is around the idea that the government should not be imposing this secular idea of what the proper healthcare policy is on religious groups, that is, they argue, a violation of the separation of church and state, because the separation of church and state means that the government shouldn't tell these religious groups what to do. Yeah.
And I think you can make the case that the government, the argument about the government is really just a fig leaf for the fact that the conservative Catholics and the conservative evangelicals both want to kind of reimpose some traditional family roles. And that's what it's really about. Right. It's this sort of conception, and you can call it the culture war, whatever you want, but it's a conception of how men and women ought to relate to each other, how the hierarchy ought to work, and that's why they have this alliance. And they can talk about the sort of role of government, and that's what they don't want, but what they're both really after is kind of turning back the clock on gender roles and on family roles, and that's the sort of real agenda. And I think
which is based on a particular religious view of gender roles, which the government has, shouldn't be endorsing or appearing to endorse.
Yeah, and you can see that in the rhetoric. All the sort of slut shaming that came out about this whole thing was shocking to a lot of people. But I think that those feelings were always there. That any woman who is in control of her own sexuality is dangerous and has to be put in her place. The fact that sentiment was there for a lot of people, that never went away. So
I think that for the general public that is not immersed in those conservative religious communities, they thought that was a thing of the past, and I think that's why this whole ginned up controversy over the contraception coverage came as such a surprise to a lot of people. Yeah. But so what, just to close out this conversation, what do you think a good strategy would be for a secularist movement to make the case about church-state separation? Because it seems like this current controversy creates this huge opening But what do they do in light of the fact that legislators and policymakers are afraid of being seen as quote-unquote hostile to religion?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I guess one approach is to say that, to hope that the courts will save you, because you may not be able to even if secularists believe, and I think they're right, that the way the Constitution is written and has been ruled on for the past 2 centuries is much closer to their vision of how church and state should be separated than it is to the vision of the contemporary GOP, let's say. That's a difficult case to make to the public. In part because, as we said, people are happy to have freedom for themselves, and so it's people like Rick Santorum want to put more religion into the public sphere, and want things like prayer in schools, and majority of the public supports prayer in schools because they think that it'll be their prayers. If you're a Christian, say, living in Dearborn, Michigan, you may not be so hung on prayer in schools because it'll be a Muslim prayer in your school. But as long as you think that it's going to be your prayer, most people are supportive of that. And that's something that's very difficult to get over. And I think this gets back to sort of the central challenge for secularists is what sorts of arguments do you want to make in what kinds of contexts and with what kinds of people? Because you have these sort of competing goals. You have the goal of sort of persuading people that you're right, and then you have a goal of making sure that government and religion don't get too entwined in a legislative way. And those are you may not want the same people making those goals. I don't think Richard Dawkins probably should be the one to make an argument about the latest piece of legislation that Rick Santorum is proposing. He's not going to be the most effective messenger on that, even if many people might be persuaded by the books that he writes. So the arguments, those kinds of arguments that have gotten so much attention from Dawkins and Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris, those I think are good books for people to read, but they don't necessarily they're not necessarily going to be the most effective things in public debate about public issues. And one of the problems is that the secular movement is it's kind of small. It's a bunch of smallish organizations, none of which are enormously powerful or visible. They don't have huge amounts of money behind them, and so I think it's a real challenge for them to be as effective and influential as they'd like to be. I don't know what the solution to that is, but
yeah. Well, it seems to me that one of the things that has been very effective for the right is they have these quote-unquote experts, and I'm not endorsing a secular movement having experts who are basically propagandists. Like, I'm thinking of David Barton, who gives a lot of these lectures on how the separation of church and state is a myth, and America was founded as a Christian nation. And he's considered to be, basically like the historian for the religious right, even though his, it's all just propaganda for the idea that there is no separation of church and state. It's not actually real rigorous intellectual thought. But I wonder if somehow a secular movement could benefit from a very public spokesperson like that, not somebody who peddles in propaganda, but somebody who can be very public like that wouldn't necessarily get into an argument that a Dawkins would get into in terms of does God exist? Right. Because that argument is not essential. In fact, it's irrelevant to the discussion about the Establishment Clause and the separation of church and state, and why that's important for maintaining a secular government, and why secular government is important and critical to a free society and for everyone of the very many different religions that we have in this country to freely practice that religion.
Right. And I think that there's a couple of elements to that. First of all, you're right, somebody like Barton is, that's his full-time job, is to try to get more religion in government. And they don't really, the people who end up getting called upon to counter him are, a historian who has another full-time job. And the other thing is that they have managed to kind of get the entire conservative coalition on board with that. And so the entire Republican Party, think tanks, interest groups, they're all going to be at least somewhat committed to that agenda. And the same is not true on the other side. in large part because Democrats know that they have to appeal to both people who are religious and people who are not religious, and so they're not going to. They're going to be much more hesitant to come on board with a full-throated kind of agenda of maintaining a strong separation between church and state, because they're worried that that will offend their more religious constituencies.
Right. I guess that's the dilemma that the Democrats find themselves in. But
so we have come to the end of this conversation without a solution.
Yeah, I apologize for that. But
Typical
listen,
liberals.
it was great. It was a great conversation. It was great to talk to you.
Yeah, it was great to talk to you too, Sarah.
Thanks.
Okay, bye-bye.